I wonder, is the sum total of happiness in society greater now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago? I really admire people, I have to say, who don't have faith and manage to hold it together to live decent, reasonable, balanced lives. I really admire that.
Pat, lovely to have you here. So good.
Great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
And you know what's really lovely is you're used to the whole podcast world. Like, I was able to look up stuff, and Sheena was looking up stuff separately about your chosen subject of passion. And it was really good for us because I have read your book. Sheena hadn't. Sheena was able to access information, and you're very good at this.
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to be able to talk about my passion, which is Father Willie Doyle, and to introduce him to many different audiences.
Mm-hmm. So, quick question for you. Speaking of passions, how did you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife? Okay, well, I mean, she's Australian. We met, I suppose, providentially in the US, actually. So,
really?
And then, so that's about 20 years ago. We're married 18 and a half years, 6 children. From the age of almost 17 down to 3.
Yeah, it's great. We met your wife, we met you first time, we haven't met before. Whenever we are in the company of people, we know straight away if these are people we're comfortable with, and that's very much the case with yourself and your wife. Yeah, so thank you.
Glad I passed the first test there.
Yeah. It's not that we're scrutinizing, but you just know.
Yeah.
You just know that you're people of God, you're people of faith, and it's good to have people of faith on the podcast. So we're here to talk about a couple of things, but first of all, Father Willie Doyle, how has your passion for his life affected you personally before we go into the details of his life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's affected me in major ways, and it also hasn't affected me enough. So if that's not too much of a contradiction. It's affected me in many ways, in the sense, obviously, I'm here talking to you about him. I'm the president of the Father Willie Doyle Association. His cause has been opened. I've been involved in promoting his cause and talking about him for about 14, 15 years now at this point. So in that sense, it's had a big impact upon me. It's had a big impact upon my family because they're involved in that apostolate as well. When I give talks about Father Willie, a lot of the children come along with me, and they help. We have stands where we sell books and have prayer cards and leaflets, and the kids actually love coming along to take part in that, and that's a good exposure and experience for them. It's also impacted me because, well, we've 2 sons, and one of them, Father Willie's full name was William Joseph Gabriel Doyle. So our eldest son, his name is Joseph William. We just reversed the 2 of them. And then we have a second son, our youngest child, our 6th child. And we decided, okay, look, we'll go and call him William as well. And I suppose we never would have chosen that name if it wasn't for Father Willie Doyle. But there's something, I suppose, kind of providential about that as well, because young Willie was born in the middle of COVID in 2021. So it wasn't quite the full strict lockdown that we had the previous year, but everything was still quite locked down. And he was born on the 6th of March. And in the middle of the night, and we take part in the domino scheme. So I don't know if you know what that is, where the mother gives birth and a few hours later comes home, with the help of midwives and so on. And so he was born in the middle of the night, and then the next afternoon went back to the hospital to bring Rachel and him home, and we were told, no, he can't go because he hasn't had a bowel movement yet, and babies have to have a bowel movement. He's going to kill me later on if he looks at this when he's older. But anyway, he has to have a bowel movement before he can leave the hospital. So we're a bit disappointed. I had to go home. Rachel had to stay in hospital. She wasn't, a bit difficult, especially with COVID and getting in and out of the hospital. But there was no bowel movement coming. So then they did more tests and scans and x-rays. And they said that he has a blockage in his bowel and he needs an operation. Now, thanks be to God, we've haven't had many health problems with the children. I know some families have had bad situations where children are in hospital a lot, but ours haven't been. So he was in Hollis Street. He was due to be transferred over to Temple Street for the operation. And we were a bit nervous about this. None of our children had an operation, and he's like 24 or 48 hours old. He's going to have an operation. with COVID, you don't know when you're going to get access to him. You don't know what's going to happen. And so we kind of discerned in that situation, I couldn't get in to see him. Rachel should probably baptize him because we don't know what's going to happen. And, we kind of felt probably meets the criteria for an emergency baptism. So with the help of one of the chaplains there, she baptized him. And the moment she says, I baptize you, William Michael, nature took its course, and he had
thanks be to God,
a natural
explosion,
a natural resolution to the problem. No need for an operation or anything like that. But it was the moment in which he was baptized, so maybe a grace through the sacrament of baptism. But we also like to think it's a grace because at that moment he was, I suppose, formally placed
welcomed.
Free and welcome, but also placed under the patronage of Father Willie Doyle because he was given the name William formally at that moment. So we kind of view it as a little sign or a little grace, and a part of the sacrament as well. So that's a big impact.
Yeah, that's a big impact. Allow me to dig a little bit deeper. Okay, how has your passion for Father Willie Doyle affected your spiritual life?
Yeah, so that's where I was going to come to, where it has helped me and where it hasn't impacted me enough. I mean, I'm the person who's least like Willie Doyle that you could find anywhere. So if you read about Willie Doyle's natural temperament and his virtues, you think, what is the opposite of Father Willie Doyle? That's probably me, to be honest. So in many ways, it's almost a bit of a mystery that I'm here talking about him, because the areas where he was naturally strong, being very strongly willed, he had a very strong willpower, and with a strong willpower comes a certain sometimes impatience. I mean, that's just the light and dark that we all have. I'm kind of the opposite. I'm maybe a little more easygoing, but not a strong willpower. Now, maybe my wife might disagree with that. I don't know, or other people might disagree, but that's my perception of it. So in that sense, I would like to be more like him. But he has helped me to see that. I mean, what was his spiritual life like? I mean, he said, to be holy, you need to do your duty and do it well, and do your duty with love. So I would try to emulate that and try to follow that. One of the things he really struggled with was giving up butter on his bread. And that's one of the things St. Josemaria had read about, and he wrote about him in his book The Way, the butter tragedy, and how this holy man of God, he didn't name him. It was only many years later people found out it was Father Willie Doyle. He struggled to give up butter on his bread. Now, I have 6 children in the house, and oftentimes I go to the cupboard in the morning for breakfast and there's no butter there because it's run out or someone has used it in baking. And I might internally want to grumble, why have butter in the bread? But I'm reminded by my family, well, Willie Doyle had his butter dry, his bread dry without butter. You can have it as well. And I used to think it's a small thing. And then the first time I tried to have my bread without butter, I realized, no, this is a bit miserable for an Irish person,
And
so
I learned this from another podcast you were on, that St. Therese of Lisieux and Father Willie Doyle were around about the same time.
Yeah.
Their ways of sanctity were completely different.
Yeah.
She would have said about herself that she wasn't able for the heroism that Father Willie adopted in his spiritual life, yet hers, she's a doctor of the church, and so, holding in balance the fact that, when I read his book and I had heard about him before and been inspired, somehow God affected me through reading about Father Willie. And he, how I perceived that is, I don't have to do what Father Willie did, but I should be more aware of making small sacrifices like St. Therese, and St. Therese wouldn't have said that about herself, but the sacrifices she made herself were, just dying to myself, in small little ways that I can, that I know I am called to, but not to lie on a trench in Belgium, for a doctor to lie on top of me. I don't get the opportunity to do that very often. Sheena, what about you? Can I ask you, reading or listening about Father Willie? By the way, this is an amazing book, To Raise the Fallen. So well written, really inspiring. I wanted to be a better person after reading about Father Willie Doyle through your book. So thank you for that. And I would recommend it to anybody. You're going to do it in their book club?
Yeah, I was just going to say that after listening to Tony's praise, and I also have a priest friend, Father Rory Brady, has been telling me about Father Willie Doyle for years. So I this is definitely going to be on our book club list for the new year. But I think with any Christian reading, it has the opportunity to affect change within you
Mm-hmm.
if you're open to it.
Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Well, like we can read these books and they're just intellectual words, but unless we're open to the Holy Spirit affecting change within us or allowing us to kind of imbibe the words that we're reading, then it's just another book.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think Father Willie...
I'm not saying that about this book.
No,
I'm saying about reading in general.
And so here we're having a two-way conversation and leaving Pat out of it about his book. But I think Father Willie would appeal to the Stoics who mightn't necessarily be fully convicted about their faith, but yet can see in his life something to be admired.
So that's one of the things with this work that we're doing to promote Father Willie and his cause, that it's not just about saying, let's get someone else canonized or tick a box, even though that's a big thing to do. It's ultimately an act of evangelization. How do we spread the faith? And we can spread the faith by telling the story of a holy person or of a saint, of somebody who's canonized. And the life of Father Willie Doyle is a great life for that, especially for men and especially even for people who are skeptical about the church. Because we hear a lot of bad news about the church. Totally. Bad news about priests, etc. Here is somebody that you can look to with confidence. Now, ultimately, we look to Jesus Christ with confidence, and he is the source of everything. But traditionally in the church, we've always held up the saints as people that we can emulate, people that we can copy, people that we can follow. And Father Willie Doyle is one of those, because even if you're skeptical about the church or skeptical about the priesthood, it's pretty hard to be skeptical about a military chaplain who is willing to be blown apart to save a man's life or to save a man's soul, or to be skeptical about a priest, as you said, Tony, who lay down face down on the wet ground and had a doctor lying his back all night long because the doctor was sick and was shivering with a fever, and Willie Doyle wasn't sick and he knew the doctor needed to get better. So he lay down on a winter's night on the wet ground and had the doctor lying his back. And if that isn't heroic charity, I don't know what is. And so in a sense, the life of Father Willie Doyle is the life of somebody who's lived the gospel, who's an enfleshment of the gospel, as it were. And you get saints that appeal to different people in different stages of life and different types of lives. And Saint Therese, as you mentioned, is a great saint, but she's not going to appeal to everybody, particularly people in the world who are maybe a bit skeptical. Willie Doyle is one of those. There are other saints as well who can appeal to people that way. And I think coming back to the issue of books, I mean, books are really important in terms of spreading the faith. So if you take Father Willie Doyle, he was a Jesuit. Where did the Jesuits originate from? They originated from Ignatius of Loyola, this very vain and proud soldier who was wounded in the Battle of Pamplona. He was recuperating in a castle in Spain. He has a broken leg. The doctors made a hash of his procedure to fix his leg. They left him with a limp. He had a bone sticking out as well. He had them saw off the bone that was sticking out and re-break his leg 500 years ago without any anesthesia so that he wouldn't have a limp. So a really vain and proud man. And the only thing he had, no Netflix or Instagram to scroll through. The only thing he had to entertain him were romance novels about chivalry, a life of Christ, and a life about the Book of the Saints. And the romance novels left him feeling sad. The book about Christ and the lives of the saints filled him with joy. And when he read the lives of the saints, what actually struck him was, look at all the things they did for Jesus Christ. They were men and women. They were men and women like me. They were human like me. They had faults, but God's grace worked in their lives to do great things. And that was a big inspiration in the life of St. Ignatius. And look at what God did with Ignatius as a result of that, through reading the lives of the saints. And for me, I would say my own faith journey, very important in terms of reading the lives of the saints. As a younger boy, I was very interested in that. I didn't grow up in a family where there was a lot of very evident faith in the house. There wasn't any prayer. There wasn't any nightly rosary or statues or pictures.
Which would have been normal for the time.
That was normal at the time. I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. But I was interested, for whatever reason, in reading the lives of the saints. And interestingly, so was Father Willie Doyle. And he speaks about how he read Butler's Lives of the Saints as a young boy. They were an inspiration for him. And when I read the original biography of Willie Doyle in 2010, I was kind of said what impact it had upon me. I mean, it blew me away, because I read the lives of a lot of saints, but none of them has impacted me the way his has. And it resonated with me for a particular reason.
I would agree with you on that. Actually, for some reason, there's a grace that comes with reading the life of Father Willie Doyle. And God is saying something to me personally, you know, and I don't want to extrapolate from that and say, what I'm saying here is I can share how, because I've experienced that as well. Somehow God is impacting me and is saying something to me through the life of this man and the example that he has. I can extrapolate and say that he's saying it to young men, or he's saying it to men in general, or he's saying it to the culture. I don't know that, but I know here's 2 people out of 3 who have been impacted by you writing, me reading this book, and it is definitely powerful. Father Willie Doyle's story, his intercession, I do believe is powerful as well before God. And let me just ask you a benign question, a ridiculous question. So you're head of department in DIT for the Marketing and Business School, TUD.
TU Dublin is what it's called now.
TU Dublin, yeah.
Yep.
So it used to be called DIT.
Yep.
And so you're also an author. Does this help your accreditation? You're a doctor. Does it help your accreditation? You have a PhD.
No, I kind of, well, I mean, my PhD is in a completely different area. So this is kind of like a hobby. So my PhD is actually in the area of alcohol marketing and the regulation of alcohol marketing.
Wow.
And we can talk about the technicalities of that if you want, but really ultimately about how marketing influences our perception of the world, and how that perception of the world, the perception of what's normal or what social norms are, how that then influences behavior. So it's something completely separate. It's not really something I would talk about at work. I mean, some people who know me well would know I'm involved in this sort of activity. It's not really
subversive activity, or
well,
would it be activity that, you know,
we're not in the stage yet where it's subversive, but who knows what's going to happen in the future in the world, you know. But you know, just people at work have all sorts of different opinions about things, and you just have to accept people where they are, accept people as colleagues.
And what about diversity?
And diversity, yeah. I mean, we live in a world where we talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion. And from my perspective as a Catholic, that has to include everybody. Has to be in you know, I should be included in any conversation there as well, you know. So I don't hide my faith particularly, but I don't bring it up every 5 minutes either. It's normal as a colleague talking to people.
Yeah.
If an opportunity comes up, and it is surprising actually, quite a lot of colleagues do have faith, and when they find somebody who has faith, they will open up and talk about it. But it's just a natural thing. But I'm not bringing it up all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's really interesting. You know, if people are stumbling across this podcast who don't have faith, they're not. I hope they're not going to be put off by what we're talking about, because we're able to explain the phenomenon that actually happens to people of faith through the activities of faith. And it's normal, you know, like if you're into Man United, you're going to read about Man United, you're going to follow the footballers or whatever, and you can be into Man United as well as into the lives of the saints with would you say, Sheena? Yeah, I'm trying to involve you in this conversation.
No, I was struck by what you were saying about the whole inclusion thing.
Yeah.
Like I've never heard it articulated like that. Like, you know, I personally sometimes feel like it's almost directed at people of faith to shut up, you know, and to turn that on its head and say, well, actually, I also have an opinion, which should be included. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Well, inclusion doesn't mean anything unless you're including everybody. And so I think people of faith have to say, well, we you know, we also have to be included in this conversation as well, you know. But I mean, your faith,
and we're not coming from a position of power, which we were before, in terms of not us, but the clerical church in Ireland abused that power, or were led to believe that it abused that power, and it probably did. But also there came many benefits to actually having a country that most of its inhabitants lived faithfully, such as they lived well, families stayed together, people were law-abiding. And, you know, these are things that we don't talk about anymore, but statistically, you know, the numbers speak for themselves. And it's something that we are, or certainly I haven't seen this conversation happen in public in Ireland, that where we cast aside faith, we cast aside the morality that is associated with faith, things that were prohibited before, or were, you know, considered to be sinful before, are now no longer sinful. And because of that, or perceived to be sinful, because of that, society embarks upon a road which is leading it to a place that is not good, unfortunately, and that's just a fact borne out by the numbers. And it doesn't mean to say that everybody must have faith. It just means that faith brings with it certain attributes which are law abiding for the most part. And truth. Yeah, the search for truth.
I mean, the faith should have fruit in our lives, you know. I mean, to line in the gospel that frightens me most, really, is, you know, from him who has received much, much is expected. And if you've received a lot of grace in your life, as I believe I have, you know, in terms of how I have faith, and many other people that I know don't, I have an obligation to live that faith and to live it well. And if you're living your faith well, it should have fruit in terms of how you treat people, how you go about doing your job. So Father Willie, you mentioned St. Therese, I mean, they would be of the view that you have to do your duty and do it well. And so therefore, if you have faith, you should be a better employee, or you should be a better manager, you should be a better colleague. And it doesn't mean to say that you're always perfect. It doesn't mean to say that everything you do is perfect, but you should be striving for that. You should be striving to be the best professional you can be. You should be striving to be the best colleague you can be. And that also means, as a Christian, meeting people where they're at, recognizing that not everyone has had the gift of faith in the same way that I may have had, and respecting that, but, you know, leaving doors open for conversations if that's where it goes, and just being the best person that you can be in the situation in which you find yourself,
and also at home. Yeah, sometimes I think we forget that part of, you know, living our faith is because it's harder to live it with the people that are around you, that are easier to just put up with.
They press our buttons.
Yeah.
Well, you're with them all the time. They're
going
to irritate you more.
And our guards are down. We have this veneer with people that we're trying to impress, that we try to impress. Sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes we're not. We're not trying to impress the people that we're at home with. And they're the people that carry the brunt of our humanity.
Yeah, but we I suppose we don't often stop to think, how am I behaving at home? Like, how am I behaving towards people, my children or my husband who comes in the door, you know, or if it was somebody else who came in the door, would I be more attentive, or just little things like that I've become aware of recently. It's like, you know, it has to begin at home. Yeah.
Thank you, Sheena. Question for you, in terms of the life that you live as a faithful man, do you think that has made your life easier? I mean, objectively, you cannot compare this to how your life would be if you didn't have faith. But let me ask the question nonetheless.
I mean, I think ultimately it has to be easier in the sense that if I believe that God's grace is available to me, and that I seek God's help and God's grace in what I do, then in that sense, life has to be easier, in the sense that one has a perspective on the sufferings and the difficulties of daily life, the difficulties of living in the world in which we live in today. I mean, there are challenges that come when you live in a culture which can be, to a certain extent, hostile to your faith, when you can see your faith belittled and so on. You know, I mean, it's maybe would have been, you know, the climate can make it a little bit more difficult. But it's really hard for me to answer that question, other than, I suppose, maybe fall back on a theoretical question.
Yeah, it's your sense of
my sense that, you know, God loves me. I have a guardian angel. I have a friend in Father Willie Doyle and other saints that I'm interested in. I would try to pray every day, try and pray in the morning. Doesn't always work so well to get it in the morning, to get it done in the morning. And in that sense, draw upon God's grace. So I think it is easier. I think I could see ways where God has helped me in multiple different ways. So in that sense, I view it as easier.
Digging a little deeper. Yeah. Do you think having faith frees you from the difficulties of life?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, but it helps you have a perspective on it. It helps you be maybe a little more detached from them. I mean, St. Ignatius, to go back to the spiritual exercises, and Father Willie was a Jesuit, so to drill into that a little bit more, St. Ignatius says that man is made to praise, reverence and serve God, and by that means to save his soul. And so I suppose if we view that this life is not all that there is, and if I viewed this life as being all that there is, I probably would live a very different life. I really admire people, I have to say, who don't have faith and manage to hold it together to live decent, reasonable, balanced lives. I really admire that. I don't know that I could do that. I think I might fall into a kind of, I don't know, despair maybe if I didn't have faith, if I felt that this world that we live in is all that there is. I think I would be interested in maximizing my pleasure at every moment. And I do admire the human virtues and qualities of people I see and colleagues at work who don't have the gift of faith, but who don't live from a perspective of maximizing pleasure at every moment. I think I probably would fall into that. I mean, I grew up in the 80s. TV was always on in my house. I loved looking, this is terrible now, I loved looking at Dallas on TV all the time.
We did too. Yeah.
I have to
we
say,
were there. We were in the house.
You were there.
In Texas,
I would love to be there.
South Fork.
South Fork. I loved looking at JR. I thought he was a fascinating character.
Bobby was the cool guy for me.
No, I love JR.
I don't know what that says about you.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. But I don't know what I would be like if I didn't have faith. I could be like J.R. Ewing, who knows?
Yeah.
But it doesn't free you from the difficulties of life. But I think it helps you have a perspective. And I think that perspective is very, very important for people. Also, I suppose to, when you have a problem, how big, they can be real problems, but the biggest thing is your eternal salvation. And to view everything in the light of that.
That's a pretty big thing. And I think it's something that we forget about in society in general. Yeah. How many conversations, this is one of the many reasons that we started this podcast, is to actually have conversations about God, about the purpose of life, what's important, why we're here, and where we're going, what happens to us after we die. And Ireland has many attributes. The Irish people are fantastic in so many ways, but this is not a strength we have, especially coming from a Catholic culture. And I don't know, is it a rebellion against the faith that was handed down but discarded before? But we're not good at having these philosophical, even on a purely secular level, on a philosophical level, we're not good at having the conversations about the meaning of life. And
I suppose there's an embarrassment there about it as well, because people don't want to be seen as like a holy Joe or something like that, and there was a negative connotation around that. Especially,
I also think it's probably not. We're not being trained to be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
And it's not polite to have conversations about the meaning.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead. Sheena, go on. Sorry, and I interrupted you.
Yeah.
I also think that it's not polite. My mother says to me, politics and religion are two things that are things you don't talk about in conversation.
We grew up thinking that.
And that's what we're led to believe. But I do actually think that philosophy is an on-ramp to conversations that go to a deeper level, that are really important, that everybody can relate to. And somehow people who have philosophical conversations, I do believe, will get there in the end, because Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If philosophers or people who are looking for meaning in life are looking for the truth, he's not going to hide himself away if people are knocking at his door looking for the truth. Would you agree with that or disagree?
No, I would agree with that, certainly. That would be the experience of many saints as well, who've gone looking for the truth and never imagined where they'd find it. If you take the example of St. Teresa Benedicta, Edith Stein, who was a philosopher, Jewish, went through a period of atheism and trying to search for the truth. And in fact, it's another example of a saint who found her faith through reading about a saint. She read the life of St. Teresa of Avila. I believe, if I'm not wrong, she read it in one night. Maybe she was a speed reader.
Yeah.
And in the morning, she was, in a sense, converted. She was, this is the truth. She found that because she was sincerely seeking. We also have to remember, in the parable, according to the parable, the Lord calls people at different times of the day, and some people he calls early in the day, some people he calls later in the day. That's not a reason to put off our conversion or to just say, I can live as I want and then on my deathbed I'll convert. That's a risky business. But the Lord has his time, and he knows us, he measures out his grace, he knows when to call us. He knows when to call us home as well to him. So I trust anyone who's searching will find the Lord.
Do you think there are people who he just doesn't call?
No, I don't think so, because he loves everybody, but the way to get to him may be different for different people. And that's why I go back to this idea, from him who has received much, much is expected. For some people, he's given a lot of grace to find him early in life and to do certain things for him. other people who he doesn't love any less, but he's called them later in life for whatever reason, or didn't overwhelm them with grace in earlier life, or they didn't respond appropriately earlier, so the grace they get is different. We're getting a bit abstract now, maybe, but he calls everybody.
This is actually a really important conversation, because not everybody, John Lonergan, I don't know if you remember who he was or is. He was the what do you call that person? Governor of Mountjoy Prison. He talk about the human dignity of the people who were inmates there, and he'd say that the people who are in here are here because of their postcode. We're 50 years on from the influx of drugs into the country, maybe longer, and society, Sheena, if I say something negative, Sheena's going to say to me, this is a positive podcast, and it is, but we're a lot further on in that decline right at the minute. There's so many people who grow up in a society who don't have the chances that we had, all three of us here sitting around the table, and probably the two of us more so than you, because we grew up in houses where the faith was external as well as internal. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the Lord understands that, and he knows it. And I think, the Lord is just, but he's also merciful. I hope I'm not speaking any heresy in that, because it's a complex area. None of us know how we're going to be, we have to, when we die, we meet the Lord and we have to render an account, and some people, if we take the parable again, some people he gave 10 talents to, and other people 5 talents, and so on. He expects a return on what he has given, and some have received more than others. More is expected.
And the church itself reserves judgment. It cannot judge who is going to heaven, who's going to hell. Hitler could be in heaven. Like literally, he could have had a deathbed. He committed suicide. He could have had a deathbed repentance, and because there's salvation available to the likes of Hitler, that gives me hope.
It was today's. Was it reading our gospel today? It was Revelation, Book of Revelation. And at the end, it'll be our book, our life story, Yeah. That's the judgment. Where did you get your formation? I'm listening to you going, wow.
You're really well formed.
Yeah.
Which is unusual in an Irish context. And again, I sound like I'm really negative towards Ireland, but I work in a mission field whereby we have missionaries from all over the world. And I would say, Mike's on the desk, I would say in general, the internationals are better formed than we have, because we've just taken our faith for granted. We stopped teaching the catechism, and people don't know what they don't know. We don't know what we don't know.
Faith formation usually stops at confirmation.
And we were the first.
Hands are freezing.
My hands are freezing.
Yeah.
We were the first generation to not be drilled in the catechism. So the things that people that knew and took for granted, we just don't know. Why are we here? Why did God make us? Basic questions like that. We just don't know the answer to. Even people in faith don't know the answer to. Whereas 10 years on, or 10 years previous, people knew the answer to those questions, and it might have been drilled into them. It wasn't beat into them. Maybe it was. I hope it wasn't. But those are fundamental answers to fundamental questions that we should all be thinking about.
Yeah. So how did I get my formation? I mean, I've never formally studied the faith in terms of any degree or program or anything like that. I went to an ordinary school. Christian Brothers School. Got an
where was that?
Dunleary.
Okay.
Dunleary, yeah. So I'm two miles from where Willie Doyle grew up. Which is why he's local to me.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't. It's the same as every other school. It wasn't.
It was Catholic.
It was Catholic, but Catholic, and that was it. In terms of my own faith, I mean, a teacher said in first class, you have to go to Mass every Sunday once you've made your first communion. So I started going to Mass every Sunday, often by myself. I mean, my parents didn't always go to Mass every Sunday, and there were 2 boys in the class who decided to become altar boys, and I said, sure, I'll join in with them. I didn't have any great aspiration to be an altar boy, so I joined. They left 2 weeks later, but I stayed on. So I was an altar boy from about the age of 7 to 12. So that helped. I taught myself to say the rosary when I was about 7. Said it myself in the evenings. And then the reality of the faith was just very real to me at that point. And then I, go to the library and find books about saints, and then start reading them. And so I still read books about saints all the time, I guess. And it's through reading, and I suppose more recently through podcasts. As busier I get, the older I get, it's a little more challenging to read, and life is busy. If I sit to read for too long, I start to nod off, which I don't like. If I could have one superpower, it would be to read without falling asleep now. But it's through just reading, and often reading the lives of the saints, I think is important.
Wow.
Did anybody ever say to you that you should be a priest?
Yeah, good question. Not really, no. And that's an issue. We talk about vocation in Ireland. I have no recollection of the years when I was an altar boy of any of the priests saying you should be a priest. And maybe we wonder why we don't have so many priests in the country. I mean, it is something that I had thought about when I was younger, and thought that's what I was called to do.
What changed your mind?
I don't know. I mean, in later life, I suppose I discerned it wasn't for me. I mean, I guess I've been able to do things as a layman and go places as a layman that priests couldn't do. That's not, I mean, the priesthood is a higher vocation in a sense, you know, and I think it is important to say that. The church says the priesthood is a higher vocation. It's not a marriage, or being a lay person is a second-class citizen in the church. But at later points in life, you know, I would have maybe met, I know one priest went past me at World Youth Day in Cologne in 2005. I think he was a missionary of charity priest. We were at something to do with Mother Teresa, and he said, "Oh, you should be a priest," but he didn't know me. He was just walking past me and said it to me, so I didn't really pay much attention at that point. So yeah, it's just how life went and how I discerned it. So look, maybe the priests I grew up with did say it, but I know.
You don't remember
of that? No. There wasn't certainly any attempt to mentor that. Yeah,
and maybe they felt that they should back off and let God do the recruiting.
Yeah, but I still think the idea should be put to people.
Invitation. Not that you should be a priest. Have you ever thought about it? Yeah,
and maybe it was said, but I don't recall it, to be honest.
Did something actually happen to you, do you think, when you were 7? Because it sounds like, I mean, that's exceptional at that age to be praying the rosary, and
in a family that wasn't.
I mean, spiritually, like
all I could say is, you know, the reality of God was clear to me at that point.
Isn't that amazing?
You know, it's hard for me to verbalize it really, but you know, it's not that I've lived a perfect life since then. Far from it. But I've never really seriously doubted the faith from those experiences I had as a child. I would say don't underestimate that children can pray. I wish I could pray as I did when I was 7, to be honest. But I think it was a grace that was given to me to have the faith at that age in ways that, from a sociological perspective, are not explainable, really. Not explainable. And that's, you know, I'm responsible for those graces that I've received, and I have to respond to those as best I can.
And as St. Augustine would say, even your response to the graces that you've received and the fact that you responded in a positive way is a grace in itself. And for us, we can't even claim credit for that. No. It's not meritorious on our part. It's purely God's grace that has given us the faith. And in terms of any judgment that we would have or whatever, or how, you know, pride is something that can creep in very easily. You know, we can't be. I
mean, I should have done a lot more with what I've received. I mean, really, a lot more, because I feel, you know, God has blessed me in many ways. You know, in terms of I'm the first in my family to go to university, etc., etc. You know, so there's a lot I've received, not through any merit of mine. Don't want to give that impression at all, anything like that.
At the end of the day, when we meet the Lord and the book is open that Sheena talks about, St. John of the Cross says that we will be judged on how we loved, first and foremost. And that's not a warm and gushy thing. That's how do we lay our lives down for the sake of those that we love? How do we lay our lives down for the sake of those that we don't like, you know, but are called to love, and so on and so forth, and therein lies the challenge.
For me, that's a harder thing, because I'm more naturally an intellectual type of person. It's one of the reasons why I say I'm very unlike Willie Doyle, who was someone who, as he said himself on one occasion, would be walking on his hands across a roof or sliding down a banister. I'm more of an intellectual type of person. And a temptation there is just to be happy doing intellectual things and to be in books and not to be in the real world and meeting people and involved in people's lives and helping them in a practical way. So I've got to be, very careful about that.
Pope Paul's the 6th encyclical Humanae Vitae. Are you comfortable talking about this just in terms of, like, we have 7 kids, you have...
Yeah, I've got 6 kids.
You have 6 kids.
Yeah.
Like, that's something that it doesn't make you a superhero because you followed the church's teaching in that area. Doesn't make us a superhero, and we're not any better than people who didn't. It was pure grace, and I would say more my wife's strong belief that this was something that we should follow. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Depends where you want to go, but
let's talk about it. Like that was a I don't know if you've ever heard of a lady called Janet Smith. So we went to hear Janet talk in Letterkenny, and I had a reaction because here was this single woman talking about how fantastic it was, and in really theoretical, philosophical, theological language about how amazing natural family planning is. And that wasn't our experience. Like it was bloody hard, and that's like, and I went along with it kicking and screaming, and our Sheena, talk about this. Like,
you're doing good.
I'm digging a hole for myself. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. But the point I'm making is, here we are, the other side of that now. We're grandparents. Our 3rd grandchild is due in a few months.
Congratulations.
God has blessed us so much through Paul VI, and that experience of actually struggling at the time through what the church had laid out for us and didn't actually apply it very well, in terms of the formation that we got. It wasn't something that Accord was doing a great job on. And, without throwing Accord under the bus, it's kind of such a niche area of Catholicism that it's the best kept secret in the Catholic Church.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's similar to looking at any of the commandments. To follow them is hard, but like any good father, he knows what's best for the child. And as a child, you go kicking and screaming against some of the things your parents ask you to do, but they know what's best for you. And I think our sexuality and that whole area of NFP, God knows what's best, and we are now bearing the fruit, or I don't know, bearing the fruit, or reaping the rewards of our faithfulness as grandparents. But at the time we couldn't maybe see that because it was hard. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I would say, Pat, you just wait there while we talk amongst ourselves.
Sorry to leave the talking.
I'm so grateful to Sheena for having the perseverance to actually stick through it. And, that's a whole nother area. Like, you could write books. Maybe we'll write a book sometime about that, because we're in a position where we're able to help young couples who are, working on this area and whatever. Like, what was your experience as the husband in that?
I mean, it's... we're Catholics, so we accept what the church teaches. I wouldn't say it's always easy, and life isn't always easy. But I think we can see the benefits of it. But it is a challenge, and I suppose at different stages of life, one has different challenges and then maybe different benefits, or the fruits coming at different points as you see. So, I mean, our children currently are aged from almost 17 down to 3. It's pretty busy. It's almost like having 2 families in a sense, because we've 4 girls from 10 to almost 17, and then 2 boys who are 3 and almost 7. So it's like I've 4 girls and almost 2 little puppy dogs running around the house, wrestling and so on. So in that sense, it is a challenge. But I know later in life, there's a different phase and a different stage of life where you talk about those fruits coming in terms of having grandchildren and so on. But that wider family network is important. It is important for people, especially for siblings, to have other siblings. Is a gift for them later in life. Now, doesn't mean the siblings always get on. They don't always, and there can be challenges there as well. But I suppose it is a gift to give a child another sibling. Bearing in mind, not every family can, and bearing in mind we live in an economic system now where it can be challenging for people, especially if they're living in Dublin. We're in a situation where I work and outside the home. Rachel works in the home, but we've one income that supports all 8 of us. Other families maybe aren't in a position to do that, and that creates a challenge for them as well.
Yeah.
And that's a sociological question. It's one for the politicians, but it's definitely something that is a major concern for me, because I actually think we're much less well off in human capital if you gauge the wealth of an economy in terms of the people who are in it and how well they're actually doing. Objectively, we're a lot poorer than we were 50 years ago.
I wonder, is the sum total of happiness in society greater now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago? It's very easy to look back at the stereotype of the poor, ignorant, malnourished, uneducated Irish person and say that they were very sad. But there's a certain stereotype there, and I think there was a certain joy in Ireland. I would recall maybe 20, 25 years ago going to other countries and saying, gosh, there's something different in people's eyes. There isn't a light that there is in the eyes of the people in Ireland. And I'd come back home and I'd see it in the Irish. There's a light in their eyes. I don't really see it so much now, to be honest. Maybe I'm imagining that. I'm willing to be contradicted and say, you're just imagining that.
Yeah, totally.
But it's something I would have perceived, at least at that time. I wonder, is the sum total of our happiness greater now that everyone has a computer in their pocket and the young people have a computer in their pocket? I don't think the sum total of our happiness is greater. The sum total of our convenience may be greater, but I don't think the sum total of our happiness is greater. And that's the thing. As a parent, I have a lot of concern about screens, phones, smartphones, and what that's.
How do you manage that?
No smartphone for the children, full stop. And that's
to what age?
That's
Yet.
I mean,
good for you.
Maybe 18. I mean, they do have a dumb phone if they're going out somewhere. We need to contact them, but they don't always need to take it with them. From my perspective, my professional background and academic background, I can see what marketing is about. I can see what social norms are, how social norms influences our perception of what's normal and not normal, or perceived to be normal rather. My language wasn't quite correct there, but what the perceived norm is. I look at the impact that social media has. It's a big experiment that we're conducting on society. I don't think the fruits of that experiment are going to be positive, to be honest. I've last year I kind of gave in and put a Father Willie Doyle account on Instagram. This was my first foray into Instagram. I'd not gone there, but just saw there was a lot of young people there and kind of thought about it and said, okay, look, we'll put up a thought for every day of the year on Instagram. I'm not a fan of the platform. I think you can get really sucked into just looking at photos and those short, snappy little videos. They kind of rewire the brain. We don't have the concentration span we used to have. Young people compare themselves to other young people. So I don't think it's added to our sum total of happiness as a society.
Yeah, I haven't heard it articulated like that, but I think that's very well said. Yeah, we're parents who won't give our kids a smartphone until they're 16. And the Australian government are now banning social media for under 16s. And I have to say, I personally, you feel as strong as me, but I've been more vocal about it. I feel that I say it at parent teacher meetings to the teachers. I say it to the principal in the secondary school. This is wrong. This is, the policy in the local secondary school is that no phones are allowed in the school, but yet every kid in the school has a phone. Now it's stopping because Norma Foley has done something about it, and that's a good thing. That's really positive. But I do feel that we just went with the perceived norm, as you said, and we went with what was easiest, and it wasn't the right thing for our kids. And it is. We're going to reap the rewards of that in mental health.
And a lot of parents say, "Well, okay, my child is the only one that won't have a phone. I don't want them to feel different." But insofar as we can, I mean, you have to recognize the psychology of each individual child. But I think we have to teach our children, especially in today's culture, that it is okay to be different. It is okay to be different. You don't have to be the same as everyone else. We can't have this conformity where everyone has the same opinion. I think there is a shift. I think there is a move away from that. I think 10 years ago it was very different. I think people are more willing to say I'm different. I think parents are more willing to say no to the smartphones. So I see some improvement, but I think a lot of damage has happened in the meantime. I hope it hasn't. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, there's nothing I'd love to be more wrong about than that.
I think objectively damage has been done.
Yeah, but I also think it's important, yes, it's okay to be different, but it helps a whole lot if you have another family who are also
100%.
on the same wavelength.
You don't want to teach your children be an oddball and be different, but have the confidence to say, I respect you and I'm me and I'm different, but we have to live in a society together. We have to get on together and let's just get on with it.
It's funny. I see that shift happens around, usually between 12 and 15, they're uber conscious of being different and it's very difficult. But usually by the time they get to 15, almost 16, they're like, actually, I don't care. I'm different and that's okay.
Yeah. And it's almost a badge of honor.
Those intervening years it's very difficult for them. Yeah.
We wanted people to get to know the man who wrote the book before they get to hear about the man who's in the book. Mm-hmm. And if you were to pick a story that has inspired you from Father Willie Doyle's life, could you tell us about that?
There's so many of them. How long do you want to be here? I mean, I've told you the story of with the doctor who lay in his back, but a story I discovered, and I'm always discovering new things about him as archival material becomes available.
Do you have access to the Jesuit Centre in
Leeson Street?
Gardiner Street. Is there?
Okay. Well, little bit about Willie Doyle's archives, which is really interesting and providential. They were missing for years, and they were thought to have been lost or destroyed somehow. There was nothing belonging to him, his notebooks, his diaries, all his personal items.
A Louis de Montfort moment.
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. And they'd been given to Alfred O'Rahilly, who wrote the original biography of Father Willie in 1920-21. There was a fire in Blackrock College. He became a Holy Ghost priest, and it was thought that they'd been lost in that or whatever. But about 12 years ago, there was a locked room in Gardiner Street Church in Dublin, the Jesuit church, and Father Barney McCookie, and if you know him,
I know him, yeah.
Famous Jesuit priest, was rector there at the time, and he was like, what's in this room that's locked, kind of under stairs vault or whatever. So we got in a locksmith to open it up, and the entire Father Willie Doyle archive was there. All of the letters, all of the notebooks, diaries, uniform, vestments,
oh my goodness,
personal items, including, I brought along his crucifix, so one of his crucifixes that we have there. And all of these items were preserved for decades by his brother Charlie, who was a Jesuit, and he'd preserved all of them, locked the door, and when he died, obviously no one thought of opening it, so it was there for decades. So a kind of Louis de Montfort moment where it was all discovered subsequently. And so they're now in the Jesuit archives as part of the process for his canonization cause. They're being studied and looked at. And something I discovered a few months ago, he was almost killed in a gas attack in April 1916. It was chemical warfare was a reality 100 years ago. He describes on that occasion he was with the men. Sorry, I've moved him right there. Yeah, I'm okay there. And he was heading off to say mass at a nearby convent at about 5 a.m. He said he was heading off, and he heard a voice in his ear. He said he had a voice in his ear saying, "Take your gas helmet," or what, gas mask. I think they called it a gas helmet at the time. So he went back and got it. He normally wouldn't take it. And as he was going down the road towards the convent, he heard explosions. He thought it was the normal explosions from battle. But then he saw this cloud of smoke and gas, and he realized it was a gas attack. So he had to go back down and help the men. He put the gas mask on, and he spent a couple of days and a night helping the men who were choking to death from the gas. And in the process, he actually swallowed some of the gas himself and was almost killed. And in fact, the doctor who he lay down to help thought he was going to die one particular night. And he pulled through, and 6 weeks later, he had 10 days leave home. Now, that was in the era before Michael O'Leary and Ryanair. Mm-hmm. So he had to get from wherever he was in Belgium or Northern France I presume, get trains and trucks, get on a boat across to wherever he got to, Dover or wherever, and then get trains back over to Holyhead, and then get a boat back over to Dublin. So he must have taken at least 1 or 2 days either side out of the 10 days. So you're now down to 6 to 8 days of leave. If it was me and I'd nearly died 6 weeks ago and I'd seen all I'd seen, I probably would have gotten under the covers and lay there crying and thinking, how could I avoid going back? As I told you, I'm very unlike Willie Doyle. So Willie Doyle went, said hello to his family, and then he got on a train and he went down to a convent in Cork and gave them a retreat.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm just like, how much energy and zeal did this man have that in the midst of all of this, on his leave home, he's giving a retreat. And it wasn't that there was a shortage of priests in Ireland at the time. There wasn't. But the man had an incredible zeal. And in one of the recent writings we've discovered, he's describing St. Patrick. And he says that when St. Patrick left Ireland, went back to Britain, wherever he was, and he had this sense of the Irish calling him, he said that St. Patrick's zeal was so great that he couldn't refuse the call and had to return to Ireland. And in a sense, I think he's describing himself there, that he had so much zeal and love for the Lord and love for souls that he couldn't refuse anything he was asked for in that regard.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Another story.
And he was also a very popular priest in terms of giving retreats, and, almost the Father Mike Schmidt of his day in Ireland.
Yeah.
Father Patrick Cahill, who would be similar in Ireland, the Irish Father Mike Schmidt. Yeah.
Very popular, giving missions and retreats all the time. He spent about 7 years in that work. He gave over 150 missions and retreats. So I suppose if you divide it up, you'd say that's about 20 or so per year. But then when you look at the archives, you see some of these are 3 weeks long. He's giving a mission for 3 weeks long. When he's giving the mission, he's preaching, obviously. He's in the confessional quite a lot, sometimes 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. He's also going out, though, to meet people who are alienated from the church.
Which is really astounding at his time,
Yeah. And he was attacked a few times. There was one occasion where a man almost came to him with a knife. People who'd been away from the church 20, 30, 40 years. And Father Willie said that he actually never met such a person who would refuse to come back to confession. So he seems to have had, at least according to his record, almost 100%, if not 100% success in bringing people back. He'd try and find a commonality with them. So he met one man who'd been away from the church for years. It turns out he'd been kind of worked in Sheffield or been a miner or something. And Father Willie had family who lived in Sheffield, and he found some commonality. So each night of the mission, he'd go back to this man's house and sit down. Some evenings they wouldn't say much to each other, but he was able to bring the conversation around to mining and the man's work and just talk to him as a human being about what he was interested in. Finally, he discovered why the man was alienated from the church, and it was something really minor. Forgive the pun there, actually.
Yeah, good choice of language.
Yeah. Didn't plan that. And he was able to bring him back to confession. There was the story of the girls on the street in England, a remarkable story when he was giving a mission there. 2 girls working on the street. He just looked at him and said, "Jesus loves you. Don't hurt him. Go home." And that's all he said, and forgot about them. Well, he didn't forget about them. I'm sure he prayed about them, but he went on his way. And about 2 years later, he was giving a retreat in a convent, and he got a telegram from his provincial saying, "Come up to Dublin." And I'm sure he was wondering, am I in trouble? What's going on here? He went up, and the provincial said, "Do you know a girl by whatever her name was?" And he said, "I don't know who that is." And the provincial said, "Well, she's in a prison cell in England, and she's asking for you, and you better go." So he got on the first mailboat, went over, went to the prison cell, and she was one of the girls he met on the street that evening. And she said, "The words you spoke to me impacted my heart. And I went home and I tried to change my life, but I was poor. I had nobody to help me. And I ended up back in the streets, and I was implicated in a murder." And she was sentenced to death, found guilty, sentenced to death. And she was due to be executed the next day. And I said to her, "Do you have any faith? Do you want to meet a priest or a vicar or a minister or whatever?" And she said, I've no faith, but there was a kind Irish priest who spoke to me on the streets a few years ago. I'd like to meet him. And so that's how they were able to track down Father Willie. So he spoke to her in the prison cell. He baptized her in the prison cell. He went and got permission, got the equipment, the hosts and so on, and said mass for her in the prison cell, gave her her first communion in the prison cell, and then accompanied her to her death. And all because of his gentleness, and maybe also this charisma of sanctity and holiness that communicated itself to others.
Let me prime you on the story. You'll tell it much better than me, of when he was, something that stuck out in my mind about his life was when he was saying mass and on some occasion, and he was saying it before all the dead bodies. And will you tell us about that?
Yeah, there was a mass at the Battle of the Somme, and he describes how he wrote a booklet on the rubrics of the mass, how to say mass properly. But when you're in the war, you have to make do with what you have. So he said his altar was a biscuit box, he said, supported on 2 bayonets in the trench. And he's saying mass there. And he said he had the biggest congregation he ever had in the war, round about him on every side, row after row after row of men. And he said they were all silent because they were all dead. It was a mass surrounded by corpses. So he offered up a mass for the dead, surrounded by the corpses. On both sides of the war, he was a man who had a universal love for others. And he said it was strange to look at these bodies. He said some had only just died and looked like they were sleeping, and others had been there for days or weeks and were foul. He describes foul and horrible to look at, with faces black and green. And he just says, I held in my hand the God of battles, their Father and Lord, and said mass for the dead, surrounded by the dead. And he said it was a very eerie experience. He was a great writer. I mean,
totally.
Yeah.
And that's the one that got me.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny, different stories catch different people.
I'm like the horror of war, but also the fact that he's saying mass for the dead, amongst the dead, the corpses of the dead. And
he wrote a letter anonymously in the Irish Catholic in May, I think probably 1917 or 16, I'm not sure which year, urging people to have masses said for the dead soldiers. It was written under a pseudonym, but it was actually him writing from the front, asking Irish Catholics at home to have masses offered up for the dead soldiers. So he had this great love for the soldiers, and it didn't just end at their death. He had a great love for them eternally.
He ended up falling as he went to 2 Anglican soldiers.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So he did on that occasion, the 16th of August 1917, what he did on so many other occasions. He got out of the trench. You're relatively safe in the trench unless the shell lands directly in the trench, which it could, but if it lands on either side, you're relatively safe unless some shrapnel or material falls in on you. So he gets out of the trench, he runs across to rescue 2 wounded officers, and they were all hit by a shell and all killed instantly. And that fact that they were 2 Anglican soldiers is something that wasn't given enough emphasis 100 years ago, whereas today we can see the significance of it, that he was a martyr of charity, but also an ecumenical martyr of charity. It didn't matter who you were, he was willing to lay down his life to save you. And in an island which has been divided upon religious grounds, I think this is a very important witness. And one of the men was from Belfast, one was from Meath, 2 officers, Charles Marlowe and Arthur Green.
Wow. And prior to Ireland's division, in terms of the North and South border, we were a united Ireland at that stage.
Yes.
Okay, under British rule. And I'm not trying to minimize that by any manner of means, but he also suffered a nervous breakdown. I think that's really important. We talked about mental health and the effects of what's happening in society, mobile phones, smartphones. Here's a man who had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah. And that's, again, another aspect of a story that maybe 100 years ago they didn't focus on so much. And there's an interesting, perhaps, prelude to that. And that's, again, something that's only maybe struck me in the last few months. Why did he have a nervous breakdown? Because there's no record. It happened in a fire. His novitiate building went on fire. There's no record of any of the other Jesuits having to leave because of a nervous breakdown. And then I put 2 and 2 together. Maybe I'm getting 5, but I don't think I am. When he was about 2 years of age, his cot went on fire. So the family were a well-to-do family. They had servants. There was a servant sitting beside the cot, knitting. She had a candle beside her. She fell asleep. She knocked over the candle. It fell into the cot. The cot went on fire. His father smelled the smoke. He had to rush into the room, lift young Willie Doyle out of the cot, throw the flaming mattress out the window. And you kind of can move on from that story. But then you wonder, was he imprinted with a kind of primitive fear of fire and smoke from that experience as a little, was he a year, 2, 3 years of age at that point in time? And then he's about 18 years of age. The novitiate building goes on fire. He has to be evacuated out of it, and he's described as having a complete nervous breakdown. He has to leave the novitiate for a period of time. There was a question mark over whether he'd be allowed back in. And it's kind of almost remarkable that he was allowed back in, actually. So he gets back in. And then he offers himself in his 40s to go to the First World War, where he's surrounded by fire and smoke and explosions and death. And it makes that offering of himself, he wasn't told to go, he wasn't forced to go, he volunteered to go. It makes that offering of himself even more heroic. But I think he's important to us today because, as we said, so many young people and not so young people suffer in this area of mental health. And here you've got this man who had this incredible transformation. He overcame it. He wasn't Superman. He was a man like all of us. He had strengths and he had weaknesses.
And he was afraid as well.
He was afraid in the war, but he relied upon God's grace. He trained himself through his penances, which are pretty rigorous. And he overcame them. So he can be a role model for anyone suffering with anxiety to overcome it, but also an intercessor to pray to him and say, look, Father Willie, I'm suffering with anxiety here, or I have a family member who's suffering with depression or has had a nervous breakdown. Please intercede and help for them. And we do receive reports of people who want to thank him for his intercession in that area.
Wow.
Thanks be to God.
Wow.
Thank you, Father Willie. Question for you. What about people who are suffering? You know, we live in an age where we're more conscious of our diet, some of us anyway, and some of us are intolerant to certain ingredients like gluten, say, for example. How would that parallel with Father Willie's life?
Well, there could be a very direct parallel because he had a digestive problem throughout his life. And we don't know, at least the archives haven't yet revealed exactly what that was. But it was a stomach problem. He describes it as, on several occasions, the old problem. So we don't know what the old problem was. But it was a dietary problem. It was a stomach problem. Certainly, as a Jesuit student, he went to Belgium for a period of time and he had to leave Belgium because the diet there didn't suit him. So I don't know if there's any medics listening who can unravel that. Maybe somebody can. And he had to go and spend some time in Stonyhurst in England then instead. So he had this digestive complaint throughout his entire life, even in the war. So it adds a certain heroism there, you know.
Totally. It makes the sacrifice all the more.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why did you ask that question?
Because there's a parallel between the culture. You know, a lot of people are gluten-free, they're dairy-free, you know, whatever. And we're more aware of what is going into our bodies. Some of us are. And I know he had I knew he had stomach problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was priming.
Okay.
It was a good prime. You'd read the source material well to ask that question.
Yeah, is right. Have you anything else you want to ask, Pat?
Well, I'd love to hear about the other book that you brought with you today.
Yeah,
I want to show people that.
The Rock from Which You Were Hewn. So that's a book that is co-edited by myself and Father John Hogan. Father John is a priest of the Diocese of Meath, a good friend, and he's also the postulator for the cause of Father Willie. And we've a great interest in the lives of the saints, and that's kind of how we got to know each other. And in reflecting upon the letter that Pope Benedict wrote to the Church in Ireland in 2010, when we were going through a bit of a crisis again about the dark legacy and history of crimes and so on, Pope Benedict said, he quoted Isaiah, where Isaiah says, "Remember the rock from which you were hewn." And Pope Benedict said, "Remember that legacy of holy Irish men and women, and draw inspiration from them." And I suppose because we're interested in Father Willie and processing his cause for canonization, I suppose we looked at the other Irish causes for canonization. And in fact, as of now, as we're recording, there are 25 Irish causes of canonization that are currently open. So the book is a biography of the people in all of those 25 Irish causes of canonization, right up to the most recent one just opened, Servant of God, Sister Claire Crockett. And then we also put in 19 other people who we thought maybe could have a cause for canonization, like Little Nelly of Holy God, very famous young child born in Waterford, died in Cork, and other people who we were aware of. And that's it's not obviously not a complete selection. It's a selection of people we were aware of. And there's no other book like it in the world, actually, because it's not blowing our own trumpet. It's just a reality that I don't think any other country has said, here's every person who we have on the cause on the road for canonization.
Are all the people that featured in the book, are they subject to active campaigning for their canonization, or some of them dormant? You know, like you're chair of the Willie Doyle Canonization Society, or whatever it's called.
Father Willie Doyle Association.
Yeah. And so Is that the same for all the other people featured in the book?
To a greater or lesser extent, some are a little more dormant than some of the older ones, but mostly they are. I mean, just as a bit of background there's only one native Irish person who has been formally canonized in about 800 years.
Say that again, because that's in case people miss that.
It bears repeating. There is one native Irish person, that's St. Oliver Plunkett, who has been canonized in 800 years. There is also St. Charles of Mount Argus, so we can adopt him if you want. He was Dutch and he lived in Dublin, died in Dublin. His shrine is in Dublin, and he was canonized in 2007. So if you want, we can say 2 Irish people canonized in 800 years, but it doesn't really help the statistics to go from 1 to 2. That is not for want of holy Irish people that we can look to and say, these are people who deserve and should be canonized. And they include, there's so many of them there, especially in that period of the late 1800s to the early 1900s.
Yeah, Frank Duff.
Frank Duff. That's just who I'm thinking of.
That was an incredible period. If you take Dublin, where I'm from, no matter where you pick in the country, you can pick people who were spent time there or were from there. And I think if you go through the book, I think almost every county, if not every county, is represented in terms of people who have an association with that county. But if you take that period of the teens, 1910s, 1920s, who have you got in Dublin? You've got Father Willie Doyle, you've got Frank Duff,
Matt Talbot,
Columba Marmion, John Sullivan,
Edel
Quinn a little bit later, Alfie Lamb a little bit later. You've got a remarkable figure who I only learned about. The same friend who told me to read the book about Willie Doyle told me to read about this man, John McGuinness. Completely forgotten
who's
about
that?
Now. John McGuinness, I find him to be fascinating. He was a young man who worked in the revenue commissioners. He was an expert golfer. He could have potentially turned pro golfer. Somebody dropped out of a retreat one weekend and they asked him, would you like to go on the retreat? He decided he'd go on the retreat. He had a complete conversion of life. The priest on the retreat said, you should all go and join the St. Vincent de Paul Society on Monday morning. He went and he did it, and he dedicated his life to looking after the poor of Dublin. He never married. He lived an exemplary professional career, reached a fairly high level in the revenue commissioners in Dublin. But every single night he was out bringing money to the poor, working for St. Vincent de Paul. There's Dublin's oldest charity, I think and I have to get the name correct, Sick and Indigent Room Keeper Society is a very unique name. He was very involved in that. He would go to homeless hostels, look after the homeless men there. He would clean the toilets in the homeless hostels. He died of malnutrition in his 40s because he gave all his money away. He was making a lot of money, and as soon as his pay came in every month, he did up a set of accounts. He had how much money he was giving to each charity, to each poor person that he knew, and he died of pellagra, which is a disease you get from malnutrition. You can argue he was imprudent to have allowed that to happen, which I think is probably true, but he didn't realize he was undermining his health, and he brought himself off to a hotel to feed himself and get himself better when he realized he'd made himself sick, but it was too late. If he was French or Spanish or Italian, we would probably all know about John McGuinness, and he might be Blessed or Saint John McGuinness now. And so what you need ultimately is you need people to say, this is someone we're praying to, this is somebody who we think could be recognized as a saint, and you start out in that process of getting people interested, telling the story of their life, writing a book. We've talked about books a lot. Books have always been very important in terms of not pushing or spreading devotion, encouraging devotion. People pick up a book and they're struck by it, as you said.
Devotion to a saint is a gift. It's not something that we're, and I know you're aware of this, but let's just articulate this point. It's not something that we're imposing on people. It's an introduction to a friend who actually has been on the journey before, who's a mentor, who can help us, and who's actually active in the faith as well as we are we're the church militant. Hopefully they're the church triumphant.
And some saints appeal to different people more than others, and that's fine. Not Father Willie Doyle isn't going to appeal to everybody. I mean, I love Saint Therese. I can objectively see why Saint Therese is such a great saint and doctor of the church, but I have a greater love for Saint Teresa of Avila, or some other Carmelites who are much less well known for whatever reason that I can't explain, appeal to me more, and that's just the way it is.
She has a more intellectual. It's your intellect, and she appeals to the intellect in a way that Saint Therese is like, it's really that simple, and
Yeah, and that's just the way it is. So, and then you've got to work. You've got to get through the writings. You know, there's a lot of processes. We could talk about the stages and so on. But something that's really important, that if I could communicate anything here, is to pray for a miracle, and to trust in God, and to pray to one person for a miracle. So, let's say, God forbid, somebody gets a terrible diagnosis on a Friday. Go to hospital, terrible scan results, you've got a really bad disease, come back on Monday for more tests. And you go on Saturday and you go and visit Sister Claire Crockett's grave, and you pray to Sister Claire Crockett. And then on the way back, you visit somebody who has a relic of Padre Pio's mitten.
No good.
And then you go and you pray to Father Willie Doyle, and then you pray to Matt Talbot. And you go to the hospital on Monday and they do the scans again, and they say, well, someone in heaven loves you because you had a terminal illness on Friday and you're in perfect health today. Praise God. That is a great miracle, and it's great that you've got that healing. But it can't be used to process a canonization cause. So to be canonized or beatified, you need to have a verifiable miracle, and it needs to be associated with one person. And
that means that we're just taking the word of the person who's experienced the miracle themselves.
No, absolutely not.
That's interesting.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So and there's a lot of medical reports you've got to go into that run into every medical report.
Yeah, I don't mean about them. So there's medical proof there that a disease existed that no longer exists. Somebody has been saved from a terminal illness. However, in terms of the intercession of the attribution of the miracle, that's basically down to somebody's word. No?
Great question.
Okay.
If you had asked me that question about a month ago, I would have said yes, but then we've learned subsequently no. So, we get reports of possible healings through Father Willie's intercession, as anyone involved in the process does. There's only so much we could say about it right now, because we don't know what's going to happen with any of those. But one of them in particular, we were following up. Father John, the postulator, was following up, and the question arose, who exactly was praying? And we said, well, there was one person praying, and then it was, well, that could be a problem, because how, we have to trust that one person was praying to Willie Doyle or whoever else it was. How do we know that they were actually praying to that person, that it's just their word? So it turns out that person was praying to other people, or telling other people they were praying to Willie Doyle. No, I'm not going to go into that case anymore.
Corroborating
evidence. So you need the corroborating evidence, actually. Yes. So it's a very strict process.
And can I just say how good that the church is rigorous in this regard, because sainthood is not handed out willy-nilly.
No.
Or recognizing, there may be saints in heaven that nobody knows are actually saints. Yeah. Oh, in order to be 100%. In heaven, you've got to be a saint.
Yeah.
But they're in terms of being a canonized saint, the church's process is incredibly rigorous.
It's to get to the point of opening a cause is even years of work in terms of paperwork. You've got to go through all the archives. You've got to make sure that there's nothing, as they say,
contrary to faith,
but nothing bad about the person. So in the case of a priest, you've got to go to now called the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, the dicastery for clergy, the dicastery for bishops. Was there ever a complaint, any safeguarding issue, etc.? So all of that is looked at very, very carefully and very rigorously. And then when it comes to any potential healing, it goes through multiple rounds of doctors. And if there's any possible physical, human explanation for healing, it's not going to stand up. It's only if the doctors say this is medically inexplicable. And I was earlier this year, I was at an event in Rome. The cardinal involved in the dicastery of saints was giving a talk, and I had an opportunity to ask him a question. And I said, you must see a lot of incredible miracles here. Can you tell us a bit about them? And he laughed, because there's so many. And he just gave an example of a saint who was recently canonized, Saint Joseph Alemagno, an Italian bishop, who founded a missionary order. And there was a man in the jungle in Brazil who was attacked by a jaguar. His skull was opened up. His brain was exposed. It took them 8 hours to get him to a hospital. They covered over the bit of brain with a banana leaf.
Oh my goodness.
And he made a complete and full recovery without any infection. And I don't know how you have your brain exposed with a banana leaf on it for 8 hours without an infection or any neurological side effects. So they see extraordinary things all the time. And there were some nuns from that order that he founded praying for the man's healing. So remarkable stories of, anyway, we won't go into them, but the point I was making is have faith, pray that God wants more Irish saints. If we have only one or two Irish people canonized over 800 years, God wants more of those for the development of the church here. Pick any Irish person, whether it's Willie Doyle or someone else, and just ask their help and report it if you get a favour.
We know a doctor who's in his 80s now who met Frank Duff and who also was involved in the process, whatever stage of the process that was, of examining a potential miracle. And unfortunately, even though he loved Frank Duff, could not attribute a miracle to it. It just didn't stand up as a miracle.
Yeah.
And again, that was owing to his integrity as a doctor. But it's the church is rigorous.
And it's rigorous. It has to be rigorous. You have to stand over it. It has to pass through panels of doctors locally, and then it goes to Rome, and they will pick experts in the field, whatever it is, whether it's something neurological, something to do with bones or cancer or whatever it is, and they have to agree, looking at every medical document and report. Does this stand up to scrutiny? Is there any medical treatment that they've had that can explain this? And I'm told it's getting increasingly difficult to, even though you can have healings and miracles for sure, but the church may not certify them as miracles related to cancer, because cancer treatments are progressing so well that if you have any sort of cancer treatment, they're very slow to certify any miracle, even if a cancer completely disappears. That's,
because you've had some intervention.
You've had some intervention. Sometimes they can be approved if it's very dramatic, but they're very slow to do cancer ones now, I believe.
Yeah. As people who work in the area of evangelization, I actually think the saints are so important in terms of evangelization, by virtue for multiple reasons, but they themselves evangelized themselves. Like you're talking about John McGuinness. So he was a good golfer. What did he do for a living?
It's all about golf.
Yeah. Oh, you like golf? There you go. He's
just taking it up. It's like, tell me more about the golf.
He worked in the revenue commissioners.
In the revenue, that's fantastic.
I won't say that's I won't comment on that. But
and good on him. Like Frank Duff was a civil servant as well. And I think Frank Duff at one stage was Michael Collins's. He was a secretary to Michael Collins. And so, it's the weave in history, that these men and women have lived through, and, it makes our ordinary everyday lives, like your work and our work,
We'll take John McGuinness. He lived a very simple life. He lived in one small apartment in Dublin city centre, and one of the items that was in his apartment when he died was a plank from Matt Talbot's bed that he got from Matt Talbot's sister. So he had a devotion to Matt Talbot, and he modelled himself on Matt Talbot. So he was called like the white collar version of Matt Talbot, who was the working man, the docker, the alcoholic who had a big conversion of life. Of course, there's a chapter about him in that book. So John McGuinness modelled himself on him explicitly. And he also became a third order Franciscan at Merchants Quay Church in Dublin. And when he was being buried, the priest said, "We're burying a second Matt Talbot today."
Wow.
So the saints imitate other saints. And
ultimately imitate Christ,
Well, that's what it all comes back to.
I think, was it Athanasius said that, part of the attraction of the incarnation is our humanity, so we can relate to other humans, and Christ became human so that we could relate to him, and equally the saints are relatable.
I think St. Paul said, "Be imitators of me as I am an imitator of Christ." And somewhere else, Pope Benedict said that, obviously we have to imitate Christ. That's ultimately what it's about. But sometimes Jesus can seem too lofty a role model. And so that's why we have the saints who are closer to us. And that's why we believe the Irish saints are important, because they saw the beautiful scenery in our country that we see. They walked the footpaths that we walked. They swam in the seas, fished in the lakes.
They experienced the culture.
Yeah. They knew what it was like to be Irish. A lot of the people in this book, quite recent, the most recent ones dying in 2015 and 2016, Sister Claire Crockett, whose cause is open, and then another died in 2015, Mary Ann O'Driscoll, was a 24-year-old woman from Dublin, 24, 25. So they saw Ireland as we see it now.
Warts and all.
Yeah.
And also they're fallen humans.
Absolutely.
Speaking of fallen humans, did John McGuinness play golf while he was doing his apostolate? You know, so he was a really good golfer. Did he give that up while he was doing his works of charity?
Do you want to know the answer?
Do you want to know the answer? My understanding, and there's not as much written about John McGuinness as there is about others, unfortunately. And look, I wish someone somewhere maybe has his archive. Please God, that'll show up at some point. But there were a few booklets and newspaper articles written about him. My understanding, I'm sorry to tell you, is that he sold his golf clubs and gave the money to the poor.
Yeah, I would have thought that.
So,
gosh,
sorry to tell you that now.
I'm screwed.
But we all have to be balanced. That's what he was called to. And other people are called to different things. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Have you any questions now before we wrap up?
No, I think it's a fascinating story, and I actually, applaud you for, like, you're a busy man, and you have a house full of kids, and yet you're still finding time to do something that you feel called to do. So thank you for your yes to the invitation to respond. You may not have had that invitation as a child for priesthood, but you're definitely responding to this invitation now.
Yeah. Can I ask you a really, not a weird question, but an important question? When you were on the altar as a child, do you remember any sensation that you got on the altar as a child? Because I was an altar boy as well.
I don't, I have to say. I don't. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do remember one occasion, which is not elevated at all. You're going in a very elevated direction. I remember one occasion where I nearly choked a priest because he had a mic around his neck.
Okay.
And I was walking away and the cord got tied around my ankle as I was going, and I was kind of pulling him and I didn't realize it. Anyway, wasn't very elevated, I'm afraid. No, I mean, I served Mass, was there to do that. I would have, I suppose, had that sense when praying the rosary as a child myself, or if I went to the church as a child to pray, but not so much on the altar as an altar boy.
Okay.
And maybe that's a sign, that's design, you weren't.
So it's a grace given to someone not us.
Have you
I totally have. Like, I remember as an altar boy, and still, at NET, we have a private Mass that we're close to the altar. And my experience of being near the altar is and this is as a child as well, I get a sense of the veil is thin and it's a portal. Mm-hmm. It's almost like Star Trek-y. Yeah. It's a portal, and that's undermines what I'm trying to say by relating it to something that's of human origin that somebody's dreamed up in their mind. This is God. This is God's altar, and the veil is thin. And that's the sense that I get when I'm there, and this is holy. Yeah,
and some people have that. I mean, it's not a grace I've had myself. But I know people who would say that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a privilege. Do you want to ask a question before we go?
Well, we usually wind up asking just, is there something in particular that you feel in your prayer time that you want to share with people, or that you've read that you're working, that's impacting?
I think, again, it's this issue of being generous with God, that, we've got to be generous with him. He's not outdone in his generosity. We have to be generous, particularly at this time in the world, this time in our country's history, but particularly this time in the world's history. We see a lot of troubles, potentials for conflict, and I think Willie Doyle is important in that regard. To need to pray for peace in the world. Father Willie Doyle was a man of peace. He didn't like the war. He said those at home have no idea what the war is like. And if you were out here, you would long for peace. It's easy for people who aren't at the front lines to say no peace and we got to keep fighting. But if you're out here in the war, you want peace. So I think being generous with God at this time of danger in the world that we are in, at least as we're recording this, we want the recording to be evergreen when anyone can look at it at any time. But I suppose always there's danger in the world. There's always danger in the world.
Yeah. And I actually enjoyed the book from an historical perspective as well.
Yeah.
I just felt it was so rich.
Yeah.
Even if a person that wants to read a book that doesn't involve faith, you can put up with the faith and enjoy the history, because there's so much there in his letters.
Yeah. But that issue of being generous with God, no matter what our situation in life is, and teaching our children to be generous with God, but also being balanced in that regard. We don't have to go and get pellagra and give up your golf clubs. You know, you've got to be balanced, live your life as an ordinary person in the world, but as a Christian, and meet people where they're at and be generous with them.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Sheena?
Well, there's a whole pile of things going around in my head, but you know, just what you're saying about meeting people where they're at, and I'm currently working on a paper that I have to write on Amoris Laetitia, the famous Pope Francis document that had a footnote that everybody went crazy on. So I'm having to research it for myself. I'm having to understand it for myself, and it has really made me think about the way that I look at the world, you know, as a Catholic, and you know, people who are in irregular situations as we see it, or as the church lays it down. And yeah, I haven't written the paper yet. I'm still gathering information, but it has really, it's a beautiful document on the family. It's all about the joy of love, and it has really opened up my mind. So,
and on that regard, I mean, other people have said it before. I think Pope Francis says that the church is a field hospital. I've seen other people describe it that the church is not a hotel for saints, but it's a hospital for sinners.
Yeah.
And the saints were also sinners. You know, they weren't living in a gilded cage of everything going well in their lives. You know, so we're all sinners. We all need mercy. Different people's sins are different. I don't have a right to judge people because their temptations and challenges and sins are different from mine. I have enough of my own that I need to reform and need to repent of.
Yeah, he also had another footnote where I can't remember who he quoted, but he said that the Eucharist is not a prize for those who comply. It is
who are deserving.
Yeah, it's not a prize. I can't remember what the words were, but it's medicine. You know, it is medicine for our venial sins. And yeah, no, I'm really working through that.
You're growing in appreciation for Pope Francis?
I've always appreciated Pope Francis, but I suppose my point is stuff like this comes up in our Catholic world, and you hear different pockets of people giving out about this and that, and I didn't really know what they were talking about, and now I have to actually figure out what are they talking about, what was the furore about, and try and make that informed decision myself.
Okay. Can I say what I'm going to say with a caveat here? Don't think I'm weird. I think it's important that we have conversations about God and about how we're getting on with God and with each other. But I think that in church circles particularly, we need to, because there's no point in us going to church out of habit or for social construct. The reason we go to church is not that we earn salvation, but that we tap into the person who's given us salvation. And our relationship with him is paramount. How we get on with him, how we're, our struggles and our victories are really, really important. That's the caveat that we have these podcasts, and that's why we ask the question at the end. So don't think I'm weird when I say that playing golf, as I'm going to be praying to John McGuinness after I read a bit more about him. Playing golf recently, I was going, I put my head above the parapet. I don't put my full body into no man's land, but I put my head above the parapet and I get shot a lot. Okay. And it's the nature of the role. You're going to get you're going to get it in the neck sometimes if you do a podcast, especially one on subjects like this. And sometimes that, heavy is the head that wears the crown. I run a mission with a bunch of missionaries in Ireland, and that can be interesting sometimes. Going through something, and the local golf club, there was and it's an absolutely it's a testament to the people who actually ran the golf club so many years ago and who still to this day run the golf club. There is a famine graveyard in the middle of the golf club. I could talk about the origins of that and whatever, but there was a workhouse close by that's still there to this day. It's been turned into a hospital, and the bodies from those who died, who fell in the famine, were brought up to this field essentially. The golf club, much to their credit, built a wall around where the people were buried, and they couldn't bury people quick enough. Built a wall around that and erected a plaque to commemorate the people who died in the famine. So every time we're playing golf, I just make a point of praying to the holy souls who are there, and asking for their intercession, praying for them, that they will be released from purgatory, etc., etc. And I had an experience this time. I went out this week just to clear my head, have a break, and whatever. And Maria phoned me on a video call. So this is our daughter who's in Belfast. She phones me on a video call in the middle of this. I've gone past the whatever, and I'm just giving the holy souls what it is I'm struggling through. And Maria phones me, and we're chatting away and whatever. And I was telling Maria, look, I'm asking for the holy souls intercession. And as I'm telling her, I realize whatever burden that I was going through was literally just lifted, like literally lifted. And that's a purely subjective thing that's only anecdotal to myself. Nobody else can, you can believe me or not believe me, but that's my story. God, through the intercession of the holy souls, gave me a grace to lift whatever burden I was carrying, and it's gone. It's not just gone for a bit, it's gone. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful to the intercession of the holy souls. And I'm grateful that as a Catholic, we're aware of, I don't want to get too intellectual. Thank you, holy souls.
This is not a commissioned advertisement for Balba Face to Norler Golf Club.
But it's a good place to play golf, and it's really good value. So thank you, Pat. Really appreciate you coming up, and looking forward to having a bite to eat. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's free. Share with your family and friends. Enjoy.